In a locked storeroom of the Egyptian Museum in Turin sits a papyrus that is nearly 3,000 years old, and on it is written something that Egyptologists still argue about today. It is not a spell, it is not a prayer. It is a list, written in the same dry administrative format the ancient Egyptians used to record tax collections and construction crews, but this list does not begin with a human pharaoh. The strangest part is that they appear in a bureaucratic king list, written in the same handwriting, using the same grammar, following the same conventions, used to record the reign of Ramesses II himself. The scribes who copied this list did not treat the Shamsu-Hor as legend, they treated them as history. And when you start pulling on that thread, you find it running through 4 separate Egyptian sources, spanning more than 2,000 years of civilization, all pointing at the same unexplained category of ruler, one that came from somewhere else, left no tomb, no city, no burial, and vanished so completely that the people who worshipped their memory could not say where they went. Let's start with what this papyrus actually is, because the facts here are not in dispute among historians, even if their meaning is. The document is called the Turin King List, or the Turin Royal Canon. It was compiled during the reign of Ramesses II in the 13th century BCE, which makes it one of the most important primary sources historians have for reconstructing the chronology of ancient Egypt. So when the Turin Canon opens, before it reaches the historical pharaohs that archaeology can independently verify, it lists first a sequence of gods who ruled for a combined period the papyrus states as over 20,000 years. Then it lists a second category, distinct from both the gods and the human pharaohs. This is where the Shamsu-Hor appear, credited with a reign of 13,420 years, according to the surviving fragments of the text. The scribes who compiled this under Ramesses II were not inventing this list from nothing. Papyrus itself tells us the compilers were copying and preserving material from older sources, sources that no longer survive independently, meaning the tradition of the Shamsu-Hor predates even this document by an unknown but likely substantial margin. Now, here's where it gets genuinely strange, because a single unusual document could be dismissed as an anomaly, a scribal error, or a piece of ceremonial flattery. But the Turin Canon is not alone. Nearly 1,000 years earlier, during the 5th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, another record was carved onto a slab of black basalt known today as the Palermo stone. The Palermo stone is one of the oldest historical documents from Egypt, and it too records a line of rulers who came before the historical dynasties, kings whom later Egyptian tradition would associate with a divine or semi-divine origin, distinguished clearly in the text from the mortal pharaohs whose reigns the stone otherwise catalogues. 2 independent documents, separated by roughly 7 or 8 centuries in the moment of their creation, using comparable formats, both preserving the memory of rulers who came before the dynastic era, and both treating that memory as worth recording in the same register used for verified historical kings. Then there are the pyramid texts, inscribed on the interior walls of pyramids, beginning with the Pyramid of Unas at the end of the 5th dynasty, making them among the oldest religious writings in any language on earth. These texts reference the Shamsu-Hor as well, but they do so in a way that is, in some respects, more telling than either king list. The pyramid texts do not introduce the Shamsu-Hor. They do not explain who they are or where they came from. They mention them the way you would mention something your reader already knows, an established reference requiring no context. That detail matters because it tells us the tradition of the Shamsu-Hor was already old and already familiar by the time the pyramid texts were carved, meaning whatever cultural memory produced, this idea predates our very earliest surviving religious literature. The 4th source is the one modern audiences hear about least, and it might be the most unusual of all. In the Temple of Edfu in southern Egypt, there's a set of inscriptions Egyptologists call the Edfu building texts. These texts are, in terms of raw age, comparatively late. They were carved during the Ptolemaic period, centuries after Alexander the Great, closer to the era of Cleopatra than to the era of the pyramid builders. They describe a homeland destroyed by catastrophe. They describe survivors who fled that catastrophe, carrying specialized architectural knowledge with them. They describe a founding cult centered on the falcon god Horus. And they describe this migration as heading toward the Nile, with some interpretations of the text placing the point of origin to the west of Egypt, in a land that no longer exists in the form the survivors once knew it. The French Egyptologist Émile Chassinat spent 40 years of his life documenting the Edfu temple inscriptions. He personally copied the texts, the reliefs, and the wall scenes, publishing his findings across 14 volumes, 8 of which contain roughly 3,000 pages of hieroglyphic transcription. 40 years is not the timeline of a hobbyist chasing a rumor. That is the timeline of a serious scholar committing an entire career to documenting a single temple's inscriptions, because he understood their significance. And what those inscriptions describe still does not have a fully settled explanation among Egyptologists, because a specific catastrophe, a specific direction of travel, and a specific transmitted body of knowledge do not read like generic religious symbolism. They read like the compressed memory of an actual historical event, reshaped over centuries into the language of myth. So now ask the obvious question. Is there anything in the independently verified archaeological and climatological record that could correspond to a real migration into the Nile Valley from the west, carrying advanced knowledge, at a time before Egypt's historical dynasties began? And the answer, remarkably, is yes, something does correspond. For thousands of years, the region we now call the Sahara Desert was not a desert at all. Climatologists refer to this period as the African humid period, sometimes called the Green Sahara, and it lasted roughly from around 10,000 years before the present down to somewhere between 6,000 and 5,000 years before the present, with the transition to aridity happening gradually and unevenly across the region rather than all at once. During this window, what is now an ocean of sand supported lakes, rivers, grasslands, and human communities who left behind rock art depicting cattle herding, swimming figures, and complex social organization. As the climate shifted and the rains retreated, these Saharan populations faced a slow but relentless collapse of their environment. And archaeologists broadly agree that this desiccation pushed populations toward remaining water sources, including the Nile Valley, in the millennia leading up to Egyptian unification around 3100 BCE. This is not speculation. This is established paleoclimatology, supported by lake sediment cores, rock art chronology, and archaeological survey data collected across decades of fieldwork in the Sahara. To put a finer point on the scale of that transformation, consider what the Green Sahara actually looked like at its height. Lake sediment cores and rock art surveys indicate the region supported permanent bodies of water, some of them substantial lakes, along with river systems, savanna grassland, and wildlife including elephants, giraffes, and hippopotamuses, none of which could survive in the desert conditions that exist there today. The rock art left behind by these populations depicts organized cattle herding, boats, and what appear to be ceremonial or social gatherings, suggesting communities with enough stability to develop shared cultural practices, not scattered, isolated bands. As the monsoon belt that watered this region gradually shifted southward over roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years, these communities did not vanish. They moved, following the retreating water sources, and one of the most obvious refuges for a population being pushed out of a drying interior is a permanent, reliable river. The Nile was exactly that. It is entirely plausible and broadly consistent with the archaeological settlement record, showing increased population density along the Nile Valley in the millennia before unification, that successive waves of Saharan migrants arrived, carrying whatever cultural, religious, and technical knowledge their societies had developed during the centuries the Sahara was still green. What is speculative, and what remains a matter of genuine scholarly debate rather than settled fact, is how directly this Saharan migration connects to the specific tradition of the Shemsu-Hor and the Edfu foundation narrative. Some researchers have proposed that the folk memory of displaced Saharan populations arriving in the Nile Valley with their own technical and organizational knowledge could plausibly have been transformed over the long span of oral tradition eventually written down into the kind of semi-divine founder narrative we see preserved in the Edfu texts and echoed in the Turin Canon's Shemsu-Hor entries. This is a real hypothesis discussed in academic circles concerned with the origins of Egyptian civilization, but it remains one interpretation among several, not a proven conclusion, and readers should treat it with the same caution any unresolved historical hypothesis deserves. Because here's the other side of this, the side that responsible historical inquiry requires us to state clearly. The majority position among professional Egyptologists is that the Shemsu-Hor, along with the broader category of divine and semi-divine pre-dynastic rulers found in the Turin Canon and the Palermo Stone, represent a literary and ideological convention rather than a literal historical record. Ancient Egyptian kingship depended heavily on the idea of unbroken continuity between the ruling pharaoh and the divine order established at the beginning of time. By tracing their authority back through a lineage that stretched to the gods themselves, pharaohs reinforced their legitimacy and their claim to be the rightful custodians of cosmic order, a concept the Egyptians called Mat. Placing the Shemsu-Hor at the head of the king list was, in this reading, less about recording actual historical rulers with verifiable 13,000-year reigns, and more about constructing an unbroken chain of legitimate authority stretching back to creation itself. This explanation accounts for the consistency across sources reasonably well, since scribes across different eras and locations would have drawn on the same well-established ideological framework about divine kingship, not necessarily on independent memories of the same historical event. Both explanations, the literary convention model and the displaced population memory model, are taken seriously in different corners of Egyptological and archaeological scholarship. And honest treatment of this topic means acknowledging that the debate has not been resolved. What can be said with confidence is this: the Shemsu-Hor are not a fringe invention. They are not something dreamed up by modern alternative history channels. They are documented repeatedly across some of the most important primary sources in Egyptology, spanning the Old Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period, a range of roughly 2,500 years of continuous textual tradition. The disagreement is not about whether ancient Egyptians believed in and recorded this category of ruler. That much is established. The disagreement is entirely about what that belief was actually rooted in. Before we get to that final layer, it is worth pausing on a separate but related puzzle that has occupied Egyptologists for well over a century, because it feeds directly into why the Shamsu-Hor question has never simply been dismissed and filed away. Egyptian civilization, as it appears in the archaeological record, does not show the kind of slow, visible arc of technological development that many other early civilizations display. Pre-dynastic cultures like Naqada, particularly Naqada the second phase, do show real gradual development in pottery styles, trade networks, and social stratification, and mainstream archaeology treats this Naqada sequence as the genuine, verifiable foundation from which dynastic Egypt emerged. That much is not in dispute. What some researchers have pointed to as puzzling is the pace and completeness of the leap that follows. Within a relatively narrow window around the time of unification, hieroglyphic writing appears already structured as a functioning system rather than a primitive protoscript slowly finding its feet. Monumental stone architecture appears with a level of planning and execution that has few obvious intermediate stages preceding it. Centralized administrative systems, capable of managing labor, taxation, and resource distribution across an entire unified state, appear already largely formed. Mainstream Egyptology generally explains this by pointing to exactly the kind of Naqada period groundwork just described, arguing that the appearance of suddenness is partly an artifact of how much pre-dynastic material has been lost, damaged, or simply not yet excavated, rather than evidence of an external or unexplained source of knowledge. That is a reasonable and widely accepted position. But it is worth noting honestly that a minority of researchers argue the gradual Naqada development, real as it is, still does not fully account for the scale of the leap in certain areas, particularly monumental construction technique. This remains a genuine, if secondary, point of debate rather than a resolved question, and it is precisely the kind of gap into which the Egyptians' own explanation, the Septepi, and the beings said to have ruled during it, naturally fits. There is one more layer to this that deserves attention, because it connects everything back to how the Egyptians themselves understood their own origins. Throughout Egyptian religious and monumental texts, there is a recurring phrase, Septepi, which translates roughly to the first time or the first occasion. This was the term Egyptians used to describe the primordial age when the gods themselves ruled the earth directly, before the era of human kingship began. And critically, the Septepi was not treated by the Egyptians as a distant, irrelevant myth confined to religious storytelling. It was invoked constantly as a source of practical authority. When temples were constructed, inscriptions frequently claimed the design followed the plans laid down during the Septepi. When religious rituals were established or renewed, priests claimed those rituals originated in the Septepi. When a pharaoh needed to justify a claim to legitimate rule, that claim was often traced conceptually back to the Septepi as the ultimate source of order and authority. British Egyptologist scholarship on this concept has described the Septepi as the period in which the fundamental principles of life, nature, and society were understood to have been established, functioning not as poetic decoration, but as the organizing logic underpinning the entire civilization's understanding of legitimate power. The Shamsu-Hor, in most interpretations, belong to this primordial category, rulers of the Septepi, positioned in a space between the fully divine and the fully human, and every pharaoh who ever claimed the throne of Egypt was, in some conceptual sense, claiming to be the living continuation of an authority that originated with beings like these. And then there is the silence. Because for all the detail these four sources provide about the fact of the Shamsu-Hor's reign, they are remarkably quiet about what became of them. No tomb has been identified as belonging to a Shamsu-Hor ruler. No city has been excavated and confidently labeled as their capital. No individual name from among their supposed 13,400-year reign survives in the way individual pharaohs' names survive, carved into cartouches and repeated across monuments. For a civilization that tracked the reign length of every verified pharaoh down to the day, and that recorded the names of construction foremen and minor court officials with the same precision it applied to kings, this absence is worth noting. It does not, on its own, prove anything extraordinary. It is equally consistent with the straightforward explanation that the Shamsu-Hor were never physical, historical rulers to begin with, and therefore left no physical trace because there was never a physical reign to leave a trace of. But it is also the detail that keeps this topic alive in scholarly discussion, rather than settling into a fully closed case, because an absence this total In a record-keeping culture this thorough is unusual regardless of which explanation you find more persuasive. What we are left with, when all four sources are placed side by side, is a genuinely interesting historical puzzle rather than a settled mystery with a hidden answer waiting to be revealed. The Turin Canon and the Palermo Stone independently preserve a category of pre-dynastic, semi-divine rulers using the same administrative conventions applied to historical kings. The pyramid texts treat this category as an already familiar concept, requiring no introduction, pushing its origin earlier than our oldest surviving religious texts. The Edfu building texts, though carved much later, claim to preserve an even older tradition describing a specific catastrophe, a specific migration, and a specific transfer of architectural knowledge, with some interpretations pointing toward an origin to the west of the Nile Valley. And independently, the paleoclimatic record confirms that a real, large-scale, west to east population displacement did occur as the Sahara transitioned from a green, habitable landscape to the desert we know today in the several thousand years leading up to Egyptian unification. Whether the Edfu narrative is a distorted folk memory of that real migration, or whether it is simply a mythological elaboration built on the same divine kingship ideology found in the earlier king lists, remains genuinely unresolved. What is not in question is the seriousness of the sources themselves. The Turin king list sits in a museum in Turin, studied by professional Egyptologists to this day, still used as a chronological reference point for reconstructing Egyptian history despite its damaged and incomplete state. The Palermo Stone remains one of the most cited primary sources for Old Kingdom history. The pyramid texts are inscribed permanently into monuments that have survived roughly 4,500 years. And the Edfu inscriptions remain on the walls of the temple Chasina, spent 4 decades documenting, still available for any researcher to study directly. These are not fringe artifacts. They are central to how Egyptologists reconstruct the earliest chapters of one of history's most influential civilizations, and within all 4 of them sits the same unresolved category of ruler, named, counted, and then left unexplained. It also helps to sit for a moment with just how unusual it is that 4 sources, this different from one another, all land on the same category of ruler. A funerary text carved into the private, sealed interior of a pyramid, meant only for the eyes of the dead king and the gods, was never intended to persuade a public audience of anything. A state administrative document like the Turin Canon existed to organize chronology for practical, bureaucratic purposes under a specific reigning king centuries later. A monumental public inscription like the Palermo Stone served a commemorative function, displayed for the living to see, and a temple archive like the Edfu texts operated under an entirely different priesthood in a different region of Egypt, working from source material its own scribes claimed was already ancient by the time they inherited it. These are 4 different genres, 4 different audiences, 4 different purposes, created across a span of roughly 2,500 years, and yet all 4 preserve the same basic claim, that before Egypt's historical kings, there was a category of ruler linked to Horus, credited with an immense span of governance, and definitively placed at the origin point of legitimate authority. If this were simply a single scribe's flourish, or a single dynasty's propaganda, you would expect it to fade or shift as political needs changed across 2.5 millennia of upheaval, foreign conquest, and religious reform. Instead, it persists, largely unchanged in its core details, through the collapse of the Old Kingdom, the turbulence of the intermediate periods, the New Kingdom's imperial expansion, and all the way into the Greek-administered Ptolemaic era. That persistence is, on its own, a data point worth taking seriously, regardless of which explanation for its origin you ultimately find more convincing. So the honest way to close this is not with a dramatic reveal, because there isn't one waiting to be uncovered here. It is with the acknowledgement that ancient Egypt, one of the most thoroughly documented civilizations in human history, chose to preserve, generation after generation, across 2,500 years of its own recorded history, the memory of rulers it placed before its own kings, credited with the vast majority of recorded time on its own official chronology, and never definitively explained where they came from or where they went. Whether that memory encodes a real, displaced population arriving from a dying Western landscape, or whether it encodes nothing more than the ideological architecture ancient kings used to justify their own divine right to rule, the hieroglyphs themselves simply record that the Shemsu-Hor existed, that they governed, and that the pharaohs who followed them, gods in their own right according to Egyptian belief, still placed something else before themselves at the beginning of the list. What that something else actually was is a question the Egyptians left open, carved in stone and written on papyrus, and it remains open today. If a story like this pulls you in, the kind where the evidence is sitting in a museum in Turin, carved into a basalt slab in a display case, written on the walls of a temple in southern Egypt, and the mystery is not invented but simply left unresolved by history itself, then this channel exists for exactly that reason. Every week, there's a new piece of the ancient world laid out the same way this one was, starting from documents and inscriptions any Egyptologist can walk up to and study today, then following the thread wherever the honest evidence actually leads, including into the places where mainstream scholars disagree with each other. No exaggeration needed, no invented sources, no shortcuts. Just the real record and the real questions it leaves open. If that is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe now, because the algorithm buries channels like this one unless people who actually care about accurate ancient history show up consistently and tell it that this content matters. Hit the bell as well, because these deep dives do not always land on a predictable schedule, and the ones that go up without warning tend to be the ones digging into sources most other channels never bother to translate or read in full. And if this particular episode raised a question for you, whether it is about the Shemsu Hor, the Sipa Tepi, the Green Sahara migration, or the gap in the archaeological record around Egypt's sudden rise, put it in the comments. Every comment gets read, and some of the strongest future episodes on this channel started as a single question someone asked after watching one of these. If you already know something about this topic that was not covered here, a source, a translation detail, a counter-argument, add it below as well. This channel would rather correct itself in the comments than leave viewers with an incomplete picture, and the discussion underneath these videos has genuinely shaped how later scripts get written. Before you go, if you want the deeper cut of any topic covered on this channel, the full source list, the untranslated passages, the academic papers behind the claims, that lives in the description of every video, so it is worth checking before you assume something here was left unexplained on purpose. Ancient Egypt spent 4,000 years writing down what it believed about its own origins. The least this channel can do is read all of it before drawing a conclusion, and the least you can do, if you want more of it, is subscribe and stay for the next one.